The last stronghold of pagan culture in what is now modern Germany was the island of Rugia, now called Rügen on the Baltic coast. Rugia happens to be the northernmost point of Germany, and the northernmost point of the island itself, now called Cape Arkona, was where the city and fortress of Arkona once stood. And this is where the last stand of German paganism took place on the 15th of June in the year 1168 CE. And on that day, the city and the people of the island, called the Rani or Rujani, who had remained resolutely pagan despite growing pressure, surrendered to a Christian army led by the Bishop Absalon and the Danish King Valdemar. Following the surrender, the statue of the god Sventovit, the leading deity of the Rugians, was dragged out of the famous temple at Arkona and destroyed on orders of the bishop, and the temple itself was demolished and a church built in its place, and the people of Arkona were ordered to convert to Christianity. So in this video, we'll take a deep dive into exactly how all this happened and what happened to the pagans of Arkona and the other main city on the island called Charenza or Charenza, and the many pagan temples that stood there, as well as the other holy sites of the island as Christianity was imposed on the people. The attack on the island could be considered the final chapter of what was called the Wendish Crusade, which was initially set in motion in 1147 CE. And this was a crusade aimed at eliminating the pagan beliefs of the Slavic people who lived between the rivers Elbe and the River Oder. The River Elbe at that time formed the definitive border and frontier between the Germanic Saxons who were Christian to the west and the pagan Slavs who occupied this territory to the east. The crusade wasn't fully successful, but the Wends had submitted to the overwhelming strength of the Crusaders, and over the next couple of decades the Wends were forced to convert to Christianity, and paganism had been eliminated on the German mainland. But with their focus on the mainland pagans, the Crusaders had not been able to pay attention to the island of Rugia during this crusade, and so the island became the last surviving centre of paganism in what is now Germany. By the way, this is part 4 of a series of videos on the Northern Crusades, and if you'd like to watch the previous 3 episodes, the links are in the description below, although it's not necessary to watch those to understand the conflict that led to the capture of Rugia. The first video is a general introduction to what was left of pagan Europe by the 12th century, and the second and third videos go through the destruction of the pagan Wends on the German mainland, a precursor to the conquest of Rugia. And a reminder, this video is split into chapters, so do feel free to skip ahead. The chapter links, as ever, are in the description below. The island of Rügen isn't particularly big, being around 32 miles from north to south and around 26 miles from east to west as the crow flies, and much of that territory was and still is covered by inland waterways. The island consists of 3 main parts. Mutland is the bulk of the island, while the Wittau Peninsula and the Jasmine Peninsula form the outerlying areas to the north and east, connected via a thin strip of land. The pagans on the island resided in 2 main cities, and these were Arkona, which was the principal and capital city of the Rugians on the extreme north of the island, situated on what was then the island of Wittau. There was a very shallow part of the sea separating it from the rest of Rugia at the time. But over time, a spit of land has risen and developed, and so the former island is now firmly connected to the rest of Rugia. The second main city was Charenza or Charenza, lying further to the south, which functioned as the Rugian administrative centre. And of course you had various towns and villages and other holy places dotted around the island. One of the prominent features was and still is a main wooded area to the east of the island, and which still exists today as the Jasmine National Park. The island was only 100 miles from the German mainland, and cities like Lübeck and less than 40 miles from Denmark at the nearest point, which made it extraordinarily vulnerable to an attack, especially as it was still pagan and all surrounding territories had now submitted to Christianity. In fact, the Danes and the Saxons to the south had already been launching raids and attacks to convert the residents to Christianity in previous decades, so as you would expect, the Rugians took the defence of the island very seriously. The city of Arkona was well fortified and defended. It stood on the highest point of the island, with the land ending in a cliff 40 metres high, and therefore the city was virtually impregnable on the coastal side. To the land side, though, it was more vulnerable. Here, the city was protected by a large wooden wall, which later came to be called Jaramarsburg, taking its name from one of the rulers of the island. The fact that the wall was made of wood would prove significant later on. There was 2 ramparts in the defence, we are told, and the wall was protected by towers. And from records, we know the defences extended around 300 metres from the north downwards and then 350 metres to the east. The 12th century Danish cleric Saxo Grammaticus, one of the chief chroniclers of those times, may well have accompanied the Danish army in their invasion of the island, and fortunately for us, recorded the attack on the island in his work Gesta Danorum, or The Deeds of the Danes. And his work is the main source we have on what happened to the Rugians and their pagan temples on the island. And if you'd like to read more on this important episode in history, I've left a link below for the book. Saxo mentions the walls of the city being as high as 50 elbows tall, with the lower part reinforced with earth. 50 elbows equates to around 80 feet, so a pretty formidable defence. But because an attack on the 3 sides facing the sea was impossible, it was pretty obvious to anyone attacking the city that the attack had to be done from the west against the wall, whatever its strengths. Charenza, or sometimes called Charenza or Charenza, the other major city, was based on the other side of the island and was also well protected by natural obstacles. In this case, it was surrounded by marshes and swampy pools all around, with only one narrow path leading in and out of the city. And this made any attack on the city particularly difficult. The marshy land, though, meant that the city was limited to the area in which it had already expanded. Sources of the time tell us that the houses in the city were very close to each other, suggesting that land was tight in the city as it could not expand easily. The houses were therefore tall, being 3 stories high. Saxo described the difficult entry to the city. Quote, Charenza is surrounded from all sides by marshes and bogs and is accessible only by a single road over a ford that is also swamp-like and difficult to cross. And if one carelessly goes down one of the sides, he inevitably drowns in it. When a man has already crossed this bog, he would enter onto a path that led between the swamp and the wall to the gate, unquote. Saxo goes on to tell us that the city was much more heavily occupied than it had been in earlier years, and this may have been due to the influx of pagan refugees from the mainland escaping the Christian conversion of the Wendish population, and certainly the frequent Danish and Saxon raids on the mainland and the island itself were not helping either, and so the people sought safety in Charenza. Quote, during the time of peace, the city would be rather empty, but now it was filled to the brim with people who built themselves houses that had 3 stories, so that the lowest carried the middle story and the top one. They stood so close to one another that there was no space there on the ground on which there could fall a stone were the city to have been assaulted by catapults, unquote. Another town on the island was Ralswick, which was used as a fishing and trading centre. And this may have been where the Rugians kept their fleet of warships, as we know they conducted raids on Denmark and Saxon territory frequently in revenge. And we also know the Rujani had a castle stronghold at a place called Rugard Hill, where the Rugian dukes made their residence. And that location in time would grow to be the town of Bergen of Rügen during the Middle Ages and to the present time. But scattered all around the island were also the fortified villages and religious sites and castles or burgs as they were called, which again typically used walls of wood and clay and were the residences of the rich or upper classes. The king of the Rugians during the 1160s, when the attack by the Danes would take place, was a man called Tetslav who ruled co-jointly with his brother called Jaromar. Now, we don't know much about him, but he was a committed pagan. The brothers had inherited the land from their father Ratislaus, who had ruled before them. The Rugian people, or Rani as they called themselves, were Slavic by race, as already mentioned, just like the Wendish people on the mainland to their south and the Pomeranians and Poles to their east. So they were different racially and culturally from the Germanic Saxons to their west. And that put another natural and sharp divide between them and the people to their west, quite apart from the matter of religion. The carrying away of Slav pagan men and women to be used as slaves in Western Europe in the early Middle Ages was widely carried out and considered legitimate, as the Slavs were pagan and not Christian. So much so that the name of the race was adopted for the trade in humans and corrupted into the word slave, an indication of the treatment the pagan Slavs frequently received from the Christian powers nearby. Sadly, the sources we have don't really contain any estimates on the size of the population of the island. The chief god of the Rani and the Wendish people in general was the god Sventovit, or Sventovitum in Latin, who was represented as a 4-headed warrior. But there were other deities as well in the Slavic pantheon. The other gods we know about are Rujavit, the god of war, Horovit, the god of lightning, and Poronut, the god of thunder, and Jarovit, who was shown as having 2 heads. Saxo neglects to describe the whole pantheon of deities, and so the only goddess we know about was called Stanicia. And he tells us she was given huge respect, and her image was on one of the war standards displayed on one of the main towers of the walls of Arkona. And this standard was the biggest, and Saxo writes that it was notable for its size and colour. The main temple of Sventovit was situated in the middle of Arkona. The god was depicted as having 4 heads, signifying wisdom, and that he could see everything and in all directions. He carried a bow which was held in his right hand, and a giant sword hung around his waist, signifying his readiness for war. In his left hand he held a horn for wine, signifying his readiness for peace and tranquility. Saxo describes the sanctuary, which had only one entrance. Quote, on a level in the midst of the city was to be seen a wooden temple of most graceful workmanship, held in honour not only for the splendour of its ornament, but for the divinity of an image set up within it. In the temple stood a huge image far overtopping all human stature, marvellous for its 4 heads and 4 necks, 2 facing the breast and 2 the back. Moreover, of those in front as well as of those behind, one looked leftwards and the other rightwards. Unquote. The temple had carvings of all sorts outside and in, and the statue itself, surrounded by purple curtains, was a magnificent work of art. And at the temple was also kept a white mare, which was given special treatment, as it was said the deity rode the horse every night. We know the temple drew pilgrims from far and wide, from the mainland and Pomerania. Sventovit was a very popular god indeed. And to honour him, an annual ceremony was carried out every year at harvest time, and pretty much the whole population went to the temple to thank the deity for the plentiful harvest. Cattle were sacrificed and feasts were arranged. The temple was given so much respect that the priest who used to clean the temple would not breathe inside the sanctuary for fear of polluting it, and would periodically come out to gather another breath before going back in. And just to the south of Arkona lay the fishing village of Witt, which still exists to this day. Another village called Puttgarten also still exists. In fact, the name means at the foot of the castle, which suggests it may have been some of the suburbs outside the fortified section of Arkona. So well respected was the temple and god that even the Christian king Svein of Denmark was devoted to the place and was known to have gifted the temple a valuable chalice for its use. And this naturally raised the anger of Christians like Saxo, however, who criticised him for donating gifts to a pagan place of worship. Saxo, in fact, blamed his downfall on his attachment to Sventovit. Quote, all of the Slavic lands venerated this god by paying tribute to him, and even the neighbouring kings gave offerings to him, not paying attention to the committed sacrilege of so doing. Among others, the King of Denmark, Sven Grath, or Sweyn III, donated a wonderfully crafted cup so as to gain the favour of the god, for which sacrilege he then paid by his unlucky demise. And this god had 2 other temples in the different places, but none was so venerated as the one at Arkona. Unquote. The other main city of Charenza held 3 important temples, amongst others dedicated to the other gods and goddesses of the pantheon. Saxo writes that the temples were 3 stories high, just like most of the housing. The main temple was dedicated to Rujavit, and there were 2 others dedicated to Porinut and Porivit, but there were others dedicated to Jaravit and other unnamed deities. It's likely the strongest part of the city was the site now named as Venza Bergwall, which was a high point of the neighbourhood. Quote, the city itself was famous by reason of 3 greatly venerated temples, which were equipped with great artworks, splendour and riches. This great respect which was given to their gods resulted in them becoming an object of worship no lesser than the common god at Arkona. Unquote. Adam of Bremen, the 11th century German chronicler, mentions that the people of Rugia were the most loyal in their faith towards the pagan gods amongst all the Slavic people. So Rugia could be considered a sort of Mount Athos to the pagans. He noted the other Slav people looked up to the Rani. Quote, it is a law amongst the Slavs that no political decision can be reached without their approval, for everyone respects them for their close relationship with the gods, more correctly the pagan deities, which they respect more fanatically than all others. Unquote. And again, later he emphasises their loyalty towards the gods. Quote, of all the people of the northern nations, the country of the Slavs alone has remained more obdurate and slower of belief than the rest. Not a barbaric state under heaven abominates Christians and priests more. Unquote. And Helmold of Bozo, the 12th century Saxon historian who lived at the same time as the conquest of Rugia, also praises them for their dedication and just like Adam of Bremen, noted their distaste for Christianity. Quote, even though the hatred of the Christian name and the tinder of superstition abides more fiercely among the Rani than among the other Slavs, they are distinguished by many natural gifts. For among them, an abundance of hospitality prevails, and they show due honour to their parents. There is not a needy person or a beggar to be found in their midst at any time. As soon as infirmity or age has made of them frail or decrepit, he is committed to the charge of his heir to be cared for with the utmost kindness. Regard for hospitality and respect for parents stand as prime virtues amongst the Slavs, unquote. And this loyalty towards their gods, combined with their pursuit of freedom, had meant that the Slavs in this area and the Rani people were the last to fall to the yoke of Christianity. Wedekind of Corvey, another chronicler of the 10th century, writes that the Slavic people in general hated the yoke of slavery and being the inferiors of the Christians. Quote, but they still preferred war to peace, praising every misfortune as less dear than their liberty. For they were a race of men that is hardy and patient of labour, accustomed to the most meagre diet, and what was usually a great burden for our soldiers, the Slavs took a certain pleasure in, unquote. Despite their allegiance to their own religion and culture, the pressure on the Rugians to convert to Christianity had been growing inexorably over the previous 50 years or so before the Danish attack. In fact, in the centuries before the Wendish Crusade of 1147, various missionaries and parties sent by the Catholic Church had already made their way into Slavic territory to convert the people, but with little success. And so military force was now turned to and sanctioned by the Catholic Church. The pressure on the Rani, as with the Wendish community immediately to their south, would come from two sources. And these were the Danes to their west and the Saxons under Henry the Lion to their southwest. With the advent of the Crusades, things began to get much more uncertain and also develop more rapidly. The First Crusade was engineered with a mind to retrieve Jerusalem from the Turks. However, the idea of permanent war against any non-Christian state or people became much more legitimized and formalized, and warring against pagans, as well as pogroms against the Jewish community inside Christian Europe, also became much more palatable. Christian European attitudes were changing and becoming much more aggressive regarding the stamping out of paganism in the Baltic area. The literature of the time featured material like the Song of Roland, which came out around 1135 CE and which extolled the virtues of fighting against heathens, this being good for the soul. And official church correspondence of the time, like the infamous Magdeburg letter, encouraged the virtues of fighting and converting the pagans. Saxo Grammaticus narrates the story of a German knight who criticized Duke Henry the Lion for not having sufficient zeal in fighting the Slavs, meaning the pagans. The German knight declares that he had already been fighting the pagans for some time and could show 3 wounds in his body, and that if he got 2 more wounds, that would be the same number of wounds as Jesus had on the cross. And by saying this, he was obviously looking forward to fighting the Slavs again. And he encouraged the Duke to wage war, and that when the day of judgment came, he would be looked on very favourably by Jesus if he showed an unbending stance against the pagans. And the story shows the level of zeal that even the ordinary working man and lower and middle classes had by this time for fighting either Muslims in the Middle East or pagans to their immediate east, and that it wasn't just the ruling aristocracy who were interested in expanding their domain and extending the reach of Christianity. And this zeal was also playing out in Poland as well, which had been converted in the late 10th century. Around the years 1124 to 1127, the Pomeranian princes decided to accept Christianity after receiving savage threats from the Polish king. All the temples and holy places of the Pomeranians were destroyed by incoming German missionaries, and churches were built over their sites. And this onslaught pretty much marked the beginning of the end of Slavic paganism in the southern Baltic region. Over the years, as Christianity quickly began to permeate Pomeranian culture and thinking, the Pomeranians would begin to have no reservations about attacking fellow Slavs who were still pagan. But the first major and organised military expedition to eliminate paganism in Rugia itself came in 1136 CE, and this was during the reign of Eric II, Immune of Denmark. The Danes arrived suddenly at Rugia with a large fleet and caught the Arkonans by surprise, and therefore gave them no chance to prepare for war. The Danes then quickly laid siege to the city, Arkona had a weakness in that the main source of fresh water was a spring which lay outside the city, and this weakness was realised and utilised by the Danes when they blocked access to the stream. The king ordered his men to dig a canal transporting the spring water away from the city. In addition, a wall was built next to the stream to prevent any sorties by the defenders. The Arkonans tried to break through but without success, and the city in consequence had been forced to surrender. Saxo writes that, quote, because the people of Arkona, neither having gathered enough troops to conduct the war, nor having found a sufficient place to amass auxiliary forces, surrendered to the necessities of life, and having promised to the Danes to convert to Christianity, they surrendered. However, the statue which they adored, the people retained because the Danes let them, unquote. Eric II probably thought that once the people promised to convert, the temples themselves would naturally fall into disuse anyway and their statues destroyed. In order to ensure their conversion, the Danes had left behind a bishop called Eric along with an assistant. Their job was to root out the traditions and rituals followed by the people and instruct them in Christian worship. Saxo tells us that the Arkonans went through the ritual of baptism in a pond, but that, quote, they were more interested in quenching their thirst than becoming Christians, for under the guise of taking part in a sacred rite, they refreshed their bodies which had grown tired during the siege. There was a priest that was left at Arkona who was supposed to guide them towards a new and better life and teach them the basics of the new faith. But as soon as Eric had left, they tossed the priest out of the city and Christianity with him. Not caring for the hostages, the Arkonans once again began to worship their idol, and so they showed how honestly they had accepted Christianity, unquote. In other words, the nominal acceptance of Christianity gave them a chance to recover their strength after the siege of the city, but that, quote, the people of Arkona, having betrayed hostages, returned to the original rites of the statue, thus rejecting the divine faith that had been given to them, unquote. So the conversion proved to be an illusion, and the Arkonans superficially submitted to the Danes, but continued to practice their religion vigorously. Saxo suggests incorrectly that the statue that they worshipped was that of Saint Vitus, and this may have been the reason why the Danes allowed the statue to remain in the temple. By 1147, the pressure became more intense still. It was in this year that the Second Crusade took place. A war against the pagan Slavs was deemed legitimate by the church, and the culture of warring with pagans was firmly established. The church leaders at the time also became significantly more aggressive. And in that year, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux had confidently announced that all pagan communities must be destroyed and that the Wendish religion was to be eliminated. Quote, for we absolutely forbid them from entering into any treaty with them, either for money or for tribute, until with God's help either the right itself or the nation is destroyed, unquote. So, consequently, while the war against Muslims was taking place in the Middle East, the Danes, along with the Saxons, launched a strong attack across the Elbe River. Although the Wendish Crusade wasn't a particular success, the sheer strength of the Saxons and the war of attrition that continued over the years weakened the Wends, and they were pummeled into submission. And over the following decades, the people were forced to convert. The Rugians in this conflict had assisted their fellow pagan Wends during this crusade, and that wasn't forgotten by the Danes or the Saxons after they'd accomplished the annexation of Wendish territory, and an attack on them seemed imminent. However, the Danish Civil War and internal problems for Henry the Lion in Saxony intervened and acted as a stay of execution for the Rugians. So let's have a look at the characters who would play a leading role in the attack once the Danish Civil War petered out. By the middle of the 12th century, three personalities had appeared on the Danish stage that would be instrumental in driving the conquest and conversions of the Rugians forward. The first was Waldemar I Knudsen, also known as Valdemar the Great. Valdemar would participate in a three-way contest for the Danish throne in 1146, a war that would end up lasting for a decade. The other two contenders were Sweyn III Grath, the son of an earlier king, and Canute V, the son of the King of Sweden. Canute was killed in battle in August 1157, and Sweyn lost to Waldemar at the Battle of Grath Heath on the 23rd of October 1157 and was killed shortly afterwards, leaving Valdemar as the last man standing. And therefore, at that time, he became the undisputed king of the Danes. Now, in this civil war, the Wends had allied themselves with Sweyn III and had ravaged the lands of Waldemar, who was a committed and zealous Christian. And this was probably because Sweyn was known to be much more liberal towards the pagans, and despite being a Christian, he was a devotee of Sventovit. But Sweyn would lose the war, and when Valdemar became sole ruler, he decided to exact revenge against the Rugians. And so this put them in the firing line when political and military matters had settled down in Denmark after the war, and Valdemar was crowned king. The second character was Eskil, Archbishop of Lund and the senior-most cleric in Denmark. The initial impulse to convert the Rugians could be said to have been initiated by the Archbishop. Eskil was consecrated Bishop of Roskilde in 1134 and would succeed Asser as the second Archbishop of Lund in 1137. And it was Eskil who harangued the Danes into launching a crusade against the Wends when the Second Crusade to the Middle East was organised in 1147. And even though it wasn't completely successful straight away, he continued campaigning for war against the pagans till his death. The third and most important character of the three was a man called Absalon, and if King Valdemar was zealously bent on destroying the pagan belief of the Rugians, then his right-hand man was even more so. Absalon was made bishop of the Diocese of Roskilde by Valdemar in 1158, and this was partly a reward due to his influential family aiding Valdemar in his quest for the throne. Valdemar also elevated Absalon to be his chief advisor, and Absalon would stay as Bishop of Roskilde for 34 years and was made Archbishop of Lund from 1178, succeeding his uncle Eskil till his death in 1202, while still keeping his position as Bishop of Roskilde. So he was easily the most powerful cleric in Denmark for a very long time. Absalon was a fanatical opponent of paganism and was heavily interested in converting the Wends and the Rugians. He would personally lead a Danish attack in 1160, shortly after he was made bishop. However, this attack and other subsequent ones didn't have sufficient success, and the Rugians managed to survive the onslaught, for the time being anyway. However, Absalon wouldn't give up, and from 1164 for the next 20 years, he would continue to lead or organise attacks against the pagans in Rugia and all along the Baltic coast to facilitate their forced conversion. Sometimes these were with the help of the Saxons, and sometimes not, depending on the political situation with Duke Henry the Lion, the Saxon monarch. It has to be remembered that the Danes were in competition with the Saxons for the Slavic territory east of the Elbe River. So while there was friendship with the Saxons due to their common Christian belief, there was also strong rivalry for fresh conquests and land. Saxo, who was a cleric himself and served under Absalon, was quite clear about his motives and his animosity towards pagans. Quote, he deemed it vain to foster religion inwardly if he let it founder outwardly, and he acted the pirate as much as the prelate. For it is no less religious to repulse the enemies of the public faith than to uphold its ceremonies. Unquote. Basically, the tolerance of any pagan activities, according to Absalon, was to agree with it. So, a very aggressive cleric who, along with Valdemar, constantly looked eastwards towards pagan lands for converts. So, those were the three main Danish characters leading Danish crusading forward in the 12th century, and given that the Rugians had helped his rival Sweyn in the Civil War, it didn't take long for Valdemar to begin plotting revenge. And he had organised attacks, some led by Absalon, as already mentioned, against the Rugians in 1159 to 1160. But the big chance came in 1168. That year, the Rani fleet, 1,500 ships strong, as we are told, and with a considerable number of men which had been sent to attack Denmark in response to Danish raids, got caught in a large storm off Norway and was wrecked, with many good fighting men lost. And this weakened the Rugians severely, and Valdemar, when he heard the news, must have realised that this was a good time to launch a new invasion and to inflict a devastating defeat on the Rugians. He asked the newly Christianized Pomeranians for help, which they eagerly agreed to, hoping for loot and plunder and a chance to annex some of the Rani's lands themselves. But he had another reason as well at this time, and that was the growing power of the Saxons to the south. He knew the Saxons also harboured ambitions to expand eastwards, and he was hoping to get there first, or at least form an alliance with them to split the rewards. And this is in fact what happened, with a strong Saxon force volunteering to join the Danes against the Rugians in the expectation of plunder. So, as Saxo writes, the opportunity to annex Rugia, as well as the chance to convert them by force, was not one that he could refuse. Quote, the king was filled with a desire of destroying their fortifications, no less than he wanted to destroy the pagan cult which was present in the town. He believed, namely, that if you were able to tame Arkona, then all of paganism on Rugia would be destroyed. For he had no doubt that so long as this statue stood, it was easier for him to conquer the country's fortifications than to defeat the pagan cult, unquote. The expedition of 1168 was to prove his biggest, and plans for the invasion were made with the help of Absalon. But these Danish war preparations became known in Rugia early on, and the Rugians decided to try diplomatic means. An emissary was sent to talk with the Danish king, as the Rugians had no desire for war at this time with their fleet destroyed. However, the king had made his mind up, and the emissary was not allowed to go back to warn the Rugians that the Danish fleet would be sailing soon, and therefore to leave them guessing as to preparations. But as soon as it became obvious that the Danes would attack, the Arkonans augmented their defences as much as they could. Saxo tells us that the city people further strengthened the walls of the city by excavating a lot of earth and piling it in front of the gates to make it harder for the Danes to force their way in. In addition to the earth, a wall was made of turf surrounding the main gate as well. On May 19th, 1168, the Danes landed on Rugia, and there's more than a good chance they used the large bay at modern-day Wiek, which provided good, safe anchorage for the Danish fleet and was only a short 8-mile march from Arkona. Joining Valdemar would be a Saxon force that had also sailed in. The Danes would, in addition, also be joined by 2 other forces, and these were recent converts to Christianity. The first was a strong Pomeranian force under the princes Casimir and Boguslav. The Pomeranians, as mentioned earlier, had been converted to Christianity quite recently, around 40 years earlier, and were now ready to turn against their fellow Slavs and fight for the Christian side. The second was a Wendish force sent by Prince Pribislav. The Wends had been forcibly converted after the Wendish Crusade of 1147, and they were now ready to lend a hand against their former allies. It has to be remembered that the Rugians had helped defeat the Danes when the Danes had landed on the Wendish coast during the Wendish Crusade of 1147, and the Rugians must have felt quite bitter at this betrayal. Berno, the Bishop of Mecklenburg, and therefore now the spiritual leader of the Wends, also accompanied them on the expedition. When the Danes advanced to Arkona, they could see the walls of the city and the preparations the Arkonans had made. Saxo tells us that hanging on the walls and towers were various banners and pennants. The chief banner of the Arkonans was dedicated to the goddess Stanicha, and this was of a large size and impressive colour and was treated as a holy banner which they gave a lot of reverence to. Saxo tells us that when they fought battles with this banner in front of them, they believed nothing could stop them, and as all the gods were with them and in the banner. Quote, they were so tremendously superstitious when it came to this rag that they ascribed to it more authority and power than to a kingly banner, and they venerated it as a divine standard. And even those who had been harmed gave the banner great reverence and honour, irrespective of how much harm it brought them, unquote. And so the siege began, and the Danes expected it to take a while as the defences of the city were strong and could not be easily overcome with siege engines. So the Danes went about things in a hurried fashion in order to capture the city before the autumn. Fortunately for the Danes, however, the forest of Jasmund was nearby and the wood from the trees was made use of. Quote, in order to bring the siege to a quicker end, all of his warriors greatly laboured on his orders to bring from nearby forests many a tree trunk which could be used to build siege engines, wrote Saxo. With the siege engines, an attack could be attempted. The alternative was simply to lay siege and to wait for the drinking water to run out, as in the time of Eric II, 3 decades earlier. Either way, it wouldn't be easy. The land that the city stood on was only separated from the rest of Rugia by a very thin slip of land, only a few hundred feet wide, and to prevent reinforcements reaching the city across the strait, the Danes placed a strong guard there. The rest of the army was situated all around the city walls, and the recently made catapults were placed all around the walls. The king delegated a lot of the organisation to Absalon, and it was Absalon who managed where the camp should be and how to divide up the troops surrounding the city. Now, despite the strengths of the fortress, the Danes had a considerable amount of luck, and the siege would end up only lasting 8 days. And this was because the weather was very hot, so hot that Saxo mentions Valdemar sitting in his tent in the shade for long periods to protect himself from the heat, while he watched the preparations going on and the skirmishing. But this prolonged heat meant the conditions were tinder dry. Now, because the defensive wall was made of wood, it was vulnerable to fire, and in these super dry conditions, there was a strong chance of fire taking hold and becoming difficult to stop. And this was exactly what happened. On the 12th of June, a strong fire started by the Danes damaged the wall considerably. What happened was that one of the young Danes during the daily skirmishing noticed an opportunity. The wooden wall was followed by a turf wall at its back, but some of the earth that had been piled up behind the main gate had collapsed, allowing a gap between part of the wall and the turf wall. And he climbed up part of the wall here that was not being guarded at this point, using spears dug into the turf as a sort of ladder and helped by his friends. Now, in the gap between the wall, he was supplied with straw bales from a wagon nearby by his fellow soldiers. The second turf wall meant that the defenders could not see what was happening, and therefore he could work in secrecy. The straw was then set on fire, and the Danish man immediately climbed out to safety. Now, this fire began spreading very rapidly, engulfing the wooden wall. As soon as the Arkonans saw the fire, they tried to put it out. Water was a precious commodity in the city, as the spring they used to use ordinarily was in Danish hands, but the small amounts they had nearby was poured on to try and stop the flames. But this was nowhere near enough. The Danes, of course, did their best to prevent the firefighting by launching missiles from their side during this time. Quickly, the fire increased, and Saxo tells us that the defenders even tried to use supplies of milk that they must have had nearby, pouring the milk onto the fire. But in the heat and in the tinder-dry conditions, the fire continued to spread along the walls inexorably. And this meant that the Rugians had to divert many of the defenders to try and prevent the fire from advancing. Absalon, who was watching the flames, quickly ran to inform the king, who drew up a chair to see the fire spreading. Now, there were obviously opportunities here for the Danes, and Valdemar would send Absalon back to see how the fire could be taken advantage of. Quote, he then left without delay to investigate the situation and approached the gates only wearing a helm and carrying a shield, and he called on the young men who were trying to storm the gate for them to spread the fire. Those now fueled the fire from all sides so that the columns and supports became engulfed in flames, and the floor of the tower burned down, and flame rose to the top and turned all the banners of their gods and other insignia into ash, wrote Saxo. So the Danes were now attacking the wall in force, seeing the defenders so occupied with putting out the flames elsewhere. The defenders fought fiercely, many giving up their lives against the Danes, and many dying from the flames which they were trying to put out. Quote, when the Rugians were thus twice placed in danger, many fell to the fire, whereas others fell to the spear, and no one could tell whether they should be more afraid of the fire or of the enemy, but some forsook their own welfare and defended the town with such firmness and relentlessness that they did not succumb until the burning ramparts lay in ruins, and those who fell on the city's walls were consumed by the same flames as if on a common pyre, for they harboured such great love for the walls of their native city that they much preferred to fall together with them than to live through their collapse. Unquote. The situation was now desperate for the defenders, as large parts of the city wall were now on fire and would shortly collapse. And there was a danger in the dry conditions that the fire could spread to the city as well. And if that happened, there was nowhere for the ordinary citizens to run, as the other side of the city backed out onto the sheer cliff. So it was obvious that defending the city would be difficult, and if taken by force, then it would no doubt be looted and plundered according to the rules of war. The Arkonans therefore decided to ask for a ceasefire while they decided whether to surrender or not. One of their men met Absalon in a quieter part of the city walls, untouched by fire. He asked the Danes to stop the attack so that they could put out the fire and then negotiate, but Absalon said they would not stop till the Arkonans themselves stopped putting out the fire. Now, this was a crafty move by the bishop, as he knew the fire was out of control, and if both sides did nothing, the fire would work in favour of the Danes by destroying more of the city walls. In desperation, the Arkonans agreed, and Absalon then went back to discuss matters with the king. He effectively told the king that the fire was doing the work for them and that there was no need to endanger more lives of his soldiers. Valdemar agreed, and a ceasefire was carried out till the Arkonans could surrender. And so, with the fire now out of control and the Arkonans, according to the agreement, not allowed to attempt to put it out, it became obvious to the city leaders that further resistance was futile. If they surrendered, the city at least could be saved. But if they continued their defence, it was inevitable that the Danes would enter and massacre the inhabitants. And so the momentous decision to lay down arms was taken. The peace treaty that Absalon and Valdemar would offer the Arkonans was a harsh one and with both religious and political demands. The terms of the peace treaty were as follows. On the matter of religion, the statue of Sventovit was ordered to be handed over to the Danes for destruction. Secondly, the entire treasury of the Temple of Sventovit, which contained the sacred treasure that had been donated to the temple over perhaps hundreds of years, was also to be handed over to the Christian church. Thirdly, all the land that had belonged to the Temple of Sventovit and its priests was to be transferred to the Christian church. Fourthly, the Arkonans must accept Christianity and be baptized. And fifth, the Arkonans must adopt Christian rituals and attend religious services in the churches from now on. On the political front, the people must accept the Danes as their overlords, and in exchange Tetzlav and his brother Jaromir would remain as lords of the island, assuming they accepted Christianity, that is. The Rugians were also to enter Danish military service as vassals as and when the Danish king ordered them to. They were also to pay an annual tribute to the amount of 40 silver coins for each pair of oxen on the island. And they were also to deliver a certain number of hostages to ensure they kept to their side of the deal. To these conditions, the Arkonans had little choice considering the spreading fire, and they would agree to them, and this effectively ended hostilities straight away. Now, this sudden ceasefire and surrender didn't please many of the Danish soldiers. They had suffered casualties and wanted to sack the city and engage in loot and plunder. Otherwise, they would go home relatively empty-handed. So angry were they that Saxo writes that they, quote, threatened to leave the king for he refused them permission to take the city and preferred a paltry sum of cash in lieu of a great victory. But Absalon would talk to the soldiers and advise them that the surrender by the Arkonans would make the other Rugian cities more amenable to a surrender as well. But if they took it by conquest and killed the inhabitants despite their agreement on surrender, then the other towns and cities would be sure to put up a great resistance. As it was, even though the fire had destroyed large parts, the base of the wall, still quite tall, remained, and it would be hard even now to take the city. So accepting a surrender would be wise. In addition, they'd already advanced the cause of Christianity. Quote, he said that the commoners should listen to their lords, not the lords to the commoners, and that it would not do for the high-born to take direction from the low-born. And further, that one could not achieve a more desired outcome and victory than the forcing of a pagan people not only to pay tribute, but also to accept Christianity, unquote. The commanders of the various units agreed with him and would go on to make their soldiers understand that victory in this way was much better in the long run. Meanwhile, it was agreed with the Arkonans that the Danes would enter the city the morning of the next day. Now that night, as the ceasefire held, a Slav called Grans from the city of Charenza came into the Danish camp. He asked for Gottschalk, a man who was used by the Danes as an interpreter, and told him that he wished to speak to Absalon. The man had come to see what was happening at the siege of Arkona, but had heard of the surrender, and this must have come as a hammer blow to the Rugians across the island, as the defences of the city had been so strong, and it appears as events panned out that morale had dropped around the island. Grans, quote, insisted on getting permission to leave and deliver news to the people of Charenza about how the Arkonans were faring and to call upon them to accept the same terms so as to prevent their destruction and so that they should not forego mercy for themselves and for the city. And he said that he would return with their answer the next day. Now, the Danes obviously didn't want the Charenzans having more time to prepare for a siege either, so he was told that Charenza would get 3 days of armistice to agree to the same conditions that the Arkonans had agreed to. After that, the offer of surrender would be withdrawn and that they would face the Danish army, so they must decide quickly. If they wanted to surrender, then Grans, along with all the pagan commanders of Rugia, should meet the Danes on the coast near the town of Charenza to agree on the deal. And after hearing this, the man would leave immediately to urge his fellow citizens to accept the treaty. And as it turned out, the city was prepared to surrender as well to avoid destruction. The next morning following the truce, the Danes marched into the city and the king promptly ordered the destruction of the statue of Sventovit and the temple. Danish soldiers went to work with axes trying to topple the work, but it was so well built that axes and swords made little impact on the statue. Care was taken that no one was injured, an injury that could be interpreted as Sventovit's wrath. Quote, when this proved impossible without swords and axes, they ripped open the curtains which hung in the temple and then clearly commanded the people who were to do this to be careful so that when that heavy statue fell, it did not crush anyone with its weight, so that people could not say that this was a punishment inflicted upon them by an angry god, unquote. Saxo records the people of the town waiting to see Sventovit gaining revenge on the Danes as they tried chopping it down. But it wasn't to be, and the statue toppled against the walls of the temple. One of the typical Christian beliefs of that time, and going all the way back to Roman times, was that pagan idols were identified with the devil or demons, and that the demon had to flee when the idol was brought down and destroyed. Sometimes the demon was seen as an animal, or sometimes a swarm of flies or other insects. In various stories about saints, demons could be seen coming out from the mouths of converts in the form of small black men as well. And this is shown in stories of Slavic idols being destroyed as well. The statue of Sventovit, when it was brought down, triggered the escape of the demon occupying it, we are told. Quote, then a demon appeared in a form of a black animal which jumped out of the inner temple, only to suddenly disappear in front of the very eyes of those who stood around, unquote. Once the statue was toppled to the ground, the king ordered the Arkonans to drag it out. Needless to say, the people of Arkona didn't want the job of destroying their own idol. Saxo puts it down to fear of the god himself, and to get around this, they ordered their prisoners of war and various merchants who were present in the city to drag the idol out. Quote, Valdemar caused the antique statue of Sventovit, which is venerated throughout the country of the Slavs, to be taken out and ordered that a rope be placed round its neck and it be dragged among the entire army in view of the Slavs, and once it was reduced to kindling, then it be tossed into the fire. And he destroyed the temple with all its cultural apparatuses and looted the shrine's rich treasure. And he ordered them to abandon the error into which they had been born and to accept the worship of the true God, wrote Helmold in the Chronica Slavorum. Meanwhile, to show the Arkonans their contempt for the idol of Sventovit, the statue was dragged to the field kitchen of the Danish army in the evening. There the wood was chopped up into small pieces to be fed into the fires lit for cooking, and no time would be wasted in building a church in the now destroyed sanctuary of the temple. Once the statue had been dragged out, the temple was set on fire and work immediately began to clear the site. Quote, after that, our people, having burned the temple, started building a basilica from the wood of siege machines, transforming utensils of war into a domicile of peace. Thus, those things that were designed to crash into enemies' bodies instead provided salvation to their spirits. As well, a day was scheduled to take care of the riches taken from the Rugians' treasury, which were given to Sventovit as a gift to his deity, unquote. Converting the people started the same day as the idol was dragged out, and as Saxo explains, Absalon didn't waste time on this front. And so the character of the city of Arkona began to change overnight into a Christian city. Quote, even the chief scribe was sent to the city so that his priestly office would habituate uncivilized, superstitious folk with Christian worship, thus replacing their sacrilegious perceptions with pious teaching, wrote Saxo. And that was the end of Arkona and the famous temple of Sventovit. With Arkona firmly in Danish hands and the emissary from Charenza indicating he could get the people of Charenza to surrender, Absalon asked Valdemar if he could head to Charenza, given that they had been given 3 days to demonstrate their willingness to submit. The king would send Absalon, accompanied by Bishop Sven of Aarhus, with 30 ships and as many men as they could hold. And this fleet sailed around the island and close to where Charenza was located, the meeting point that had been agreed with the emissary Granza. The plan was for the king to arrive with the main Danish force later in the day. So, as Granza had promised, the city elders had agreed to surrender to the Danes. And the reasons gleaned from what Saxo writes were complex. We know from accounts that the city was full to the brim with refugees from all parts of the island as the Danish army began mopping up resistance. Now, if the Danes had laid siege to the city, things looked pretty grim to the city elders. With many more mouths to feed, it would have been difficult at the best of times, but under a siege, things didn't look good. For that is what would have undoubtedly happened, as the city was only accessible through a single road through the marshland. The city, being enclosed and already tightly built, could not have had substantial stores of food for so many people. So, at the location agreed upon with Granza, Tetslav and Jaromir, along with all the Rani nobility and other notables, could be seen waiting as the Danish ships sailed round and laid anchor. The Rugian leaders were escorted onto the ship that Absalon had sailed on. Quote, Absalon received them in good faith on his ship, and when they had accepted all the same conditions of surrender as had the Arkonans, then Absalon kept them on his ship until the king arrived. This one agreed regarding all the points of the armistice, and thereupon Absalon picked from among all the Rugian nobles only Jaromir, and together with him, as well as with Bishop Svend from Aarhus, he set out towards Charenza. As for the others, he ordered his brother Esbern to receive them as guests and not let them leave before he came back. All this so as to guarantee a safe trip to the city. Unquote. So, with the Charenzan leaders kept as hostages, Absalon could be sure not to meet any violence. He travelled into the city with 30 men, as the city elders had told him more would mean a greater chance of altercations with the city people. Along the way, they were met by 6,000 people of the town who were lining the road, which apparently made Bishop Sven not a little nervous, but the people showed friendliness in their submission. But the friendly nature that Absalon had shown in turn to the Charenzan leadership didn't last long. On reaching the city, Absalon would promptly order the demolition of the temples and the statues of the gods. The temple of Rugiavit was first. Rugiavit was the main deity of Carentia and was considered the god of war, and consequently this was the main temple of the city. The temple had a forecourt, and there were purple curtains around the shrine with pillars holding the roof gable. The inner sanctum was in the middle of the building. Absalon and his men tore down the curtains to reveal the statue of Rugiavit, which was made of oak. He then ordered his men to begin the destruction. Quote, the Danes began then, to the horror of the entire city, to chop their axes with all their might at his legs, and when they were cut through, the whole body fell on the ground with a great crash. Unquote. Following this, the statue was then dragged out of the temple, just like that of Sventovit at Arkona. And next were the statues of Porivit and Porinut at two other nearby temples. Quote, not satisfied with its demolition, Absalon's workforce now stretched their hands all the more eagerly towards the image of Porivit worshipped in the temple close by. On it were implanted 5 heads, though it had been fashioned without weapons. After that effigy had been brought down, they assailed the sacred precincts of Porinut. Its statue displayed 4 faces, and a 5th was inserted in its breast, with its left hand touching the forehead, its right the chin. Here again the attendants did good service, chopping at the figure with their axes until it toppled. Unquote. All 3 statues of the gods were dragged around, with Bishop Sven of Aarhus deciding to go a step further to show his contempt. Quote, Sven in particular was teaching the Carentians to despise the statues more, and decided to stand high on the statue while some Carentians were dragging it. This action had to increase the weight of the insult. The burden of that dragging was impeded by the additional load, and no less from seeing a scene of the foreign priest putting his feet on the domestic deities. Unquote. The locals were then ordered to burn the idols themselves within the town as the Danes watched. The citizens, however, now powerless, could not refuse, but fearful that the burning of the statues might trigger a fire in the closely packed houses of the city, pleaded that it be done outside the city. A large fire, as at Arkona, could easily consume the town. But it's more likely they simply didn't wish to burn their statues. Finally, Absalon insisted they burn the idols, arguing that the gods had been unable to help themselves by protecting the temples, so there was no need for the people to be anxious. And under duress, and with Absalon refusing to change his mind, the people agreed. And so you had the strange sight of the 3 statues of the gods of the Charenzans being burnt by their own people as the Danish bishop and soldiers watched. Meanwhile, other smaller temples in the city were also demolished. Now, while Bishop Sven had been deputized for the destruction of the statues, Absalon had been busy marking out and consecrating 3 cemeteries that the Danes could now use on the island for their dead, and that the Charenzans must use for Christian burials, as they were now ordered to convert to Christianity as well. After this, he arrived back at Charenza, and just like at Arkona, the townspeople were ordered to be baptized en masse, and churches were ordered to be built in place of the temples, which were being torn down at this very time. Quote, likewise, by constructing churches in a large number of localities, they exchanged the dens of an esoteric superstition for the edifices of public religion, wrote Saxo. Taxa also tells us that the treasure that had been donated to the temples of the island, which consisted of 7 large chests full to the brim with valuables and riches, was confiscated and transferred to the church. And as at Arkona, the extensive estates around the city that belonged to the temples were transferred to the Catholic Church. Quote, on the morrow of the next day, there gathered learned men and chaplains of all the commanders in their holy robes and baptized the people of the country. And likewise, in many places, they erected churches, and so the houses of the Lord were created in place of these abandoned ruins, unquote. Absalon would end up organizing the construction of 12 churches on the island before he departed, and Rügen was then subjected to Absalon's bishopric of Roskilde. And with the surrender of Charenza, the whole island now fell into Danish hands, and the country of the Rani became the Danish Principality of Rugia. Over the coming weeks and months, Valdemar would make Rugia the new Danish administrative centre. And it seems the excitement in Denmark and amongst the Danish nobles in capturing Rugia was quite high, as there was a feeling that Arkona should be the new capital of Denmark. However, from a strategic point of view, it was felt that the Saxons to the south, sometimes Christian allies against pagans and sometimes political enemies, were simply too close and that the capital needed to be further away in a safer area. It also happened to be very close to Pomerania, with which the Danes would wage war against. So the idea, while popular, was ultimately rejected. Instead, a new fortress which Absalon had commenced building in 1167 was chosen as the new capital, and this fortress and the surrounding town over time would develop and evolve into the new modern-day city of Copenhagen. Copenhagen means trading port, and perhaps the fact that it was a trading port confirmed its new status. And you could say that was a good decision, given that Rugia eventually fell to the Saxon Germans anyway. The news of the conquest of the island would reach the Pope shortly, and he would reward Absalon by placing Rügen under his spiritual authority. The island would become part of the Danish Archdiocese of Roskilde. On his return to Denmark after the conquest, Absalon was determined not to allow paganism to flourish again. He would organize a fresh batch of priests to continue the work of converting the people and to replace the ones he had left behind, and thereby allowing Christianity and Christian culture to permeate the culture of the island. And Christian mythology, as usual, began to develop, with plenty of miracles being claimed as the people were increasingly oriented towards Christianity, with those who rebelled being punished by the divine, apparently for their intransigence. Quote, and miracles were not lacking there to confirm their teachings, for many of the Rugians that were feeble and ailing were brought back to health by their fervent prayers, which I believe God caused more to convince the people than by reason of any holiness of the priests. But those that rejected Christianity were punished with great feebleness, so that it was clear that God rewarded those who accepted his word and punished those who made light of it, unquote. And so with this forced Christianization, monasteries and churches replaced the temples and indigenous holy places. But the Danish success didn't mean all Rugians submitted meekly, and some were determined to carry out resistance. And there are stories of small rebellions with Christian priests and monks being killed in Rugia, but being harshly put down by the Danish occupiers. The customs and traditions of the Rugians, as with the Wendish and Slav people on the mainland, could only be put down with great difficulty, as the 13th century Polish priest Wincenty of Kilsa wrote in his work Legenda Sancti Stanislai. He describes that, quote, even till this very day, during feasts thrown by Slavs, one encounters pagan songs, hand-clapping, and pagan greeting toasts, unquote. And this was around 100 years after the Danish conquest. However, with Danes migrating to Rugia and intermarriage, it was inevitable that a radical change in culture would take place that would strangle the Slavic customs and practices. Tetzlav and his brother would continue ruling the island from their capital at Charenza. In 1170, 2 years after the conquest, Tetzlav died of natural causes, but his brother Jaromir lived on, and it appears that Jaromir may have refused to convert earlier. We know from the records that he was offered the role of sole prince of Rugia by the Danes, but only if he agreed to convert, which he did. Jaromir then became the new puppet ruler of the island, and he would die in 1218. And you could say this marked the final turning point for the island and the dissolving of the Rugian pagan identity, because his son who would succeed him, Witzlav I, would go on to marry a Danish aristocratic woman, and the ruling clan therefore became half Danish and Christian. In 1325, the last prince of Rugia, Witzlav III, died, and that ended the Rugian aristocratic line. And in that year, Rugia became Saxon German territory, and the island was now the focus of migration of German colonizers, further changing the demographics and diluting the Slavic blood of the people. The records state that by the 14th century, the Slavic language had, to all intents and purposes, disappeared. Only one couple in the 14th century could speak the native Rugian language. And the language went extinct when the last Rujani speaking woman, who lived on the Jasmine Peninsula, died in the year 1404. Her name was Gulitsina, and her death meant she carried the knowledge of the Rugian language with her. And with her passing, you could say the Rujani people were finally extinguished. So, quickly going back to the conquest, there were some losers in this battle for Rugia, excluding the Rugians themselves, of course. Saxo tells us that there was some disagreement as to the spoils after the conquest. The Pomeranian dukes, Bogislav and Casimir, weren't too happy either, as they had expected Rugia to be divided up between the victors. They'd come with their troops for the conquest, but had received nothing in return apart from some financial reward, but the Danes had kept the island for themselves. Quote, at the same time, the Pomeranian dukes demanded to be released home, and after they had been friends of the king, they left in anger, for they counted on Tetzlav being dethroned and that they should themselves rule Rugia in recognition of their war service. Thereafter, this became the source of a long-running war between them and the Danes, unquote. The same evening that the conquest was finished and Charenza had surrendered, they left for the nearest island to separate themselves from the Danes. In revenge, the Pomeranians would launch various attacks on the Danish coast in the coming months and years. And in return, Valdemar would wage war against the Pomeranians. And in these wars, the Rugians, now the vassals of the Danes, had to assist as allies, which they did at the siege of Stettin by Valdemar in 1170, for example. The Pomeranian attacks were large enough to trigger a large building program in Denmark, with various castles built at strategic points to protect the coastline, and we've already mentioned Copenhagen Castle, of course. The other party that had taken part was also disappointed. The Saxon king, Henry the Lion, who had supplied troops for the expedition, learned that the island had been annexed by the Danes and that they had kept the vast bulk of all the loot and plunder taken from the temples. And he was also irate at the fact that the Danish church had now annexed the island and that it was not a Saxon diocese. But the Pope had already made his decision to reward Absalon. However, the Danes did share some of the treasure with the Saxons in 1171, 3 years after the conquest, resulting in peace between the two countries, for a while at least. And now, moving to the present day, Rügen is actually one of the most popular holiday places in Germany due to its stunning location and scenery and lengthy beaches. Unfortunately, Mother Nature has, over the centuries, taken big bites of the island. At the Cape of Arkona, the erosion is significant, and the cliff is losing around a metre every year to the sea. And it looks like the erosion is continuing, albeit slowly. It's estimated that the cliff eroded at a rate of around 10 to 20 metres per century. So, as you can work out, if we take the worst case scenario, that probably amounts to a loss of around 150 metres of land where the former city lay. And what's also added to the issue was a significant earthquake in the Baltic in the year 1308, which devastated the island, taking around half of the side of Arkona with it into the sea, along with a good portion of the rest of the island. So this gradual erosion means we may in time lose the entire area of the temple and city to the waves, unfortunately. But you can still see parts of the ramparts of this former fortress to this day. So what that means is that archaeological excavations have been taking place around what is left before nature reclaims everything. The place where the former temple of Sventovit stood remains, and broken weapons and other odds and ends have been found. And currently, instead of the ancient fortress, 2 lighthouses rise. The first was built in 1826 and the second in 1902. And the whole island is pretty much a national park now. The Forest of Jasmine was the living place of the god Pisamar and is an extremely pleasant place for a walk, apparently. So, is there anything else left on the island to remind us of the original Rugians and the Danish conquest? Well, there is a church constructed over an important temple site by Jaromir after his conversion, which still exists today. And that is St. Mary's Church, or Marienkirche at Rügen, which was constructed from 1185 onwards. Rügen Hill had been a Rügen stronghold previously, and the new settlement around the church would now evolve into the modern town of Bergen of Rügen. The church was completed in 1193, and with the pagan temples entirely wiped out, that meant that the church is now the oldest building on the island. The church would function as the royal church for Jaromir, but later it was turned into a Cistercian convent. And the common belief is that Jaromir himself is buried underneath the gravestone embedded in the church's outer wall. And another place to visit in Bergen is the museum, which holds two statues of the god Sventovit. But a more historic place is a village called Altenkirchen, which is around 11 kilometres south of Arkona. And this place was founded by the Danes after the conquest, so it is one of the oldest sites there. And if you visit the church there, you'll find an item that was plundered from the Temple of Arkona. And that is a rectangular stone, 1.15 metres high, with a relief showing one of the priests of Sventovit, a bearded man with long clothes as those of a priest, holding a vessel shaped as a horn of wine in one of his hands, and he is depicted standing on a small pyramid. And this almost definitely comes from the Temple of Sventovit, the priest of Sventovit being the only person allowed to touch and fill the horn of the god. It's called the Sventovitstein, or the Stone of Sventovit, and an alternative theory is that it may have been the tombstone or part of the tombstone of Tetslab. It lies just above the foundation base, which is laid on its side, the stone being possibly deliberately situated this way by the Christian builders to show the superiority of the Christian god over the pagan ones. And we also have a stone baptistry in the church with 4 heads carved on it, looking at 4 directions. Also almost definitely looted from the temple as well, since it fits well with the description of Sventovit. And the name Sventovit itself proved difficult to erase, as various places on the island seem to have that as part of their name. For example, the village of Swantov, or Sweetagora, which is a hill dedicated to the god, and where apparently many devotees from all the Slavic peoples used to congregate. And another example is the town of Putbus, which has a Slavic name meaning at the foot of the shrine, and this suggests that this was a pagan settlement which developed close to a holy place. The village of Wittau exists only around a kilometre away from what used to be Arkona, so that would be a good stopping place for the exploration of the Cape. There is a little church there as well, which, however, doesn't go back to the time of the conquest. We know that the village of Bobin formerly had a sanctuary to the Slavic god Baba, and various communal graves have been found in the forests under oak trees around the island, and this was a Slavic custom. And you can also visit the site of Charenza, or modern-day Gars. The Slavenberg Gars is a hilly oval area on which the city stronghold was built, and you can picture the Gaza Lake, which is now much reduced, surrounding the entire area at some point. Presumably over the centuries, the low-lying areas around the city were drained of water. And lastly, if you're driving to Rügen, you'll probably pass through the town of Stralsund on the mainland. And in the town, the memory of the king of the Rugians, Tetslav, also lives on. You may find yourself passing through the street called Tetzlavstrasse. But I was surprised to learn that as we move through the 21st century, the indigenous beliefs of the Slavic people are now recovering. We know the native Polish church, as it is called, promotes worship of Sventovit. And who knows, maybe in the future there will be another temple dedicated to the god at or near where the city of Arkona was situated. So, of course, the action against the Wends on the mainland during the Second Crusade and after, and then running up to 1168 in the attack against the Rugians, was the very start of what became known as the Northern Crusades, which would last 300 years odd. With the Wends weakened and eventually annexed during and after the Second Crusade and the fall of the island of Rugia, the pressure would be on the Pomeranians, who were already nominally converted, and further east the Prussians. And later on, the Baltic people further along the coastline would also feel the pain, and we'll be covering these areas in future videos. So I hope this video was useful and gives you some information on the last of the pagans on German soil. I do hope to visit Rügen shortly and look forward to doing another video showing these places on the island up close, including any excavation work and finds in the local museums. But that's it for now, and a really big thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one, hopefully.